I never imagined that installing storm windows on my own house would land me in front of a circuit court judge, watching an entire homeowners association get dismantled piece by piece. But here I am, sitting in this courtroom on a humid Tuesday morning in August, listening to Judge Patricia Morrison explain why the Willowbrook Estates HOA needs to be dissolved and placed under state receivership. Let me back up 6 months to February, when this whole nightmare started. My name is Travis Kellerman, and I had just bought a beautiful colonial-style home in Willowbrook Estates, a planned community outside of Richmond, Virginia. The house was perfect, built in 1998 with 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard that backed up to a small pond. My wife Emma and I had been looking for months, and this place checked every box we had. The HOA seemed reasonable enough during our walkthrough. Monthly fees were only $90 and the covenants looked standard. I should have read them more carefully. That winter was brutal. Virginia does not usually get hit too hard, but February 2026 brought 3 major snowstorms and temperatures that dropped into the single digits. Our heating bills were astronomical, nearly $400 for a single month. Emma was 8 months pregnant with our first child, and keeping the house warm was not negotiable. I started researching ways to improve our insulation without breaking the bank on a full renovation. That is when I discovered storm windows. For anyone who does not know, storm windows are essentially secondary windows that you install over your existing ones. They create an insulating air pocket that dramatically reduces heat loss. They are a fraction of the cost of replacement windows, and for a house our size, I was looking at maybe $3,000 versus $15,000 for new windows. It was a no-brainer. I did my research, found a reputable company called Superior Storm Solutions out of Charlottesville, and scheduled an installation for early March. The windows would be white aluminum frames with low E glass, matching our existing window trim perfectly. The installer, a guy named Bob who had been doing this for 20 years, assured me they would look clean and professional. I was excited to cut our heating bills and make the house more comfortable before the baby arrived. The installation took 2 days. Bob and his crew were meticulous, measuring everything twice, caulking every seam, making sure the windows opened and closed smoothly. When they finished, I walked around the outside of the house, and honestly, you could barely tell they were there. They blended right in with the original windows. The inside difference was immediate. You could feel how much less drafty the rooms were. That night, the thermostat barely kicked on even though it was still in the 30s outside. 3 days later, I got the letter. It was in a cream-colored envelope with the Willowbrook Estates HOA return address, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The letter was from Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, and it was not friendly. Dear Mr. Kellerman, it has come to our attention that you have made unauthorized exterior modifications to your property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. Specifically, you have installed storm windows without submitting an Architectural Review Committee application or receiving approval. Per Section 7.3 of the Willowbrook Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, all exterior modifications must be pre-approved. You are hereby ordered to remove these installations within 15 days or face daily fines of $50. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Regards, Brenda Patterson, HOA President. I read it 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. I grabbed the CCRs that our real estate agent had given us and started flipping through them. Section 7.3 did require approval for exterior modifications, but it also listed examples: additions, decks, fences, sheds, significant landscaping changes, exterior paint colors, and roof replacements. Storm windows were not mentioned anywhere. I kept reading through the architectural guidelines, and nowhere did it say anything about windows at all, except that replacement windows had to match the original style and color. I called Emma into the kitchen and showed her the letter. She was exhausted, her feet swollen, counting down the days until her due date, and this was the last thing we needed. "Can they really do this?" she asked, sitting down heavily at the table. "I do not know," I admitted. "The storm windows are not even listed in the restrictions. And they look fine. They are not changing the appearance of the house in any significant way." "Maybe you should just go talk to her," Emma suggested. "Explain the situation. Tell her about the heating bills and the baby coming. Maybe she will be reasonable." I should have known better, but I agreed to try. The next evening, I walked 3 houses down to 892 Maple Ridge Drive, where Brenda Patterson lived in a meticulously maintained brick colonial that looked like it had been staged for a magazine shoot. Every shrub was trimmed to geometric perfection, every blade of grass the exact same height. A wooden sign next to the door said, "The Pattersons," in flowing script. Brenda answered after my second knock. She was probably in her mid-50s, with blonde hair sprayed into an immovable helmet and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She wore a crisp white blouse and khaki pants, even though it was 7 in the evening. "Travis Kellerman," I said, extending my hand. "From 847. I wanted to talk to you about the letter regarding my storm windows." She did not shake my hand. "Mr. Kellerman, I was expecting you might stop by. Please come in." Her living room was as perfect as her yard. White furniture that looked like no one had ever sat on it, decorative pillows arranged at precise angles, and not a single item out of place. She gestured to a chair, and I sat carefully, feeling like I might break something. "I will get right to the point," Brenda said, settling into the chair across from me. "Those storm windows are not acceptable. They were not approved, and they detract from the unified aesthetic of our community. With respect, Mrs. Patterson, they look identical to regular windows from the outside. My installer specifically matched them to the existing trim, and storm windows are not listed anywhere in the CCRs as requiring approval." Her smile was thin and cold. "Section 7.3 is quite clear. All exterior modifications require approval. Storm windows are an exterior modification. But the examples given are major changes. Additions, decks, fences. Storm windows are maintenance items. They are like replacing a mailbox or repainting your shutters the same color." "Those items are also supposed to be approved," she said sharply. "Though we have been lenient on minor maintenance because homeowners use good judgment, your storm windows are not minor maintenance. They are a visible alteration to the facade of your home." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mrs. Patterson, Brenda, my wife is about to have a baby. Our heating bills were $400 last month. These windows are going to save us thousands of dollars over the years and make our home more comfortable and energy efficient. They are a positive improvement. Your personal financial situation is not the HOA's concern," she replied. "Our concern is maintaining property values and aesthetic standards for all residents. If I approve your storm windows, then everyone will want to do whatever they want without approval. It is a slippery slope. So submit it to the architectural committee now. I will fill out whatever paperwork you need. Let them review it and approve it retroactively." Brenda shook her head. "The committee meets quarterly. The next meeting is not until June. And even if they approved it, which I doubt they would, you installed without permission. That is the violation." "This is ridiculous," I said, feeling my composure slipping. They are storm windows. They are a normal, common home improvement. They are energy efficient and they look fine. Your opinion on how they look is noted, Brenda said, standing up. You have 13 days remaining to remove them. I suggest you contact your installer. Good evening, Mr. Kellerman. I drove Emma to the hospital on March 19th. After 14 hours of labor, our daughter Sophie was born at 6 in the morning on March 20th, weighing 7 pounds, 9 ounces. She was perfect. Emma was exhausted but radiant. I was so overwhelmed with love and terror and joy that I completely forgot about the HOA until we got home 2 days later and found another letter. This one informed me that the 15-day deadline had passed, and I was now being fined $50 per day. They had helpfully included a calculation showing that I currently owed $400, with more accruing daily. I was instructed to pay within 10 days or face legal action and a potential lien on my property. I barely slept that night. Sophie woke up every 2 hours to eat, and between feedings, I lay in bed doing math in my head. $50 a day was $350 a week, $1,500 a month. The storm windows cost $3,000. In 2 months, the fines would exceed what I paid for the windows, and I would still have to pay to have them removed. The next morning, while Emma napped and Sophie slept in her bassinet, I called a real estate attorney named Michael Richardson, who had been recommended by a colleague. His consultation fee was $250 for an hour, which felt like a lot, but I was desperate for advice. Michael was in his early 40s, calm and measured, with an office in downtown Richmond. I brought all my paperwork: the CCRs, the HOA letters, receipts from the window installation, photos of the house before and after, even copies of our heating bills. He spread everything out on his desk and spent 20 minutes reading through the documents while I sat anxiously, checking my phone for texts from Emma. "Okay," he finally said. "Here is what I think. First, the good news. The CCRs do not specifically mention storm windows, and the examples provided for required modifications are all substantially larger changes than what you did. Second, storm windows are generally considered maintenance rather than modification in most jurisdictions. Third, your windows are not visible in any obtrusive way based on these photos. They are neutral colored and match the existing trim. So I have a case. You have an argument," he corrected. "Whether you have a case depends on how far you want to take this. HOAs have broad authority under Virginia law, but that authority is not unlimited. They cannot enforce rules arbitrarily or capriciously, and they cannot fine homeowners for violations that are not clearly defined in the governing documents. What would taking it further look like?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "You would formally dispute the fines in writing, citing the specific language in the CCRs and arguing that storm windows are not covered under Section 7.3. The HOA would likely reject your dispute. Then you would request a hearing before the board, which they are required to provide under Virginia HOA law. If that does not work, you could file suit in circuit court to have the fines invalidated. How much would that cost, to file suit? With court costs and attorney fees, probably $10,000 to $15,000, and that is if it does not drag on. These cases can take a year or more." My heart sank. So basically, I am screwed. They can just fine me into oblivion, and fighting it costs more than the windows are worth. "Not necessarily," Michael said. "Here is the thing. If you do file suit and you win, the HOA can be ordered to pay your attorney fees. Virginia Code Section 55.1/1839 allows courts to award reasonable attorney fees in HOA disputes if the homeowner substantially prevails. And if you can prove the HOA acted arbitrarily or in bad faith, you might have additional remedies available. Like what? In extreme cases, courts can intervene in HOA governance. They can invalidate board decisions, order new elections, even appoint a receiver to manage the association if mismanagement is severe enough. But that is rare. You would need to show a pattern of abuse or violation of the law, not just one bad decision. I left Michael's office feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. I paid his consultation fee and asked him to draft a formal dispute letter for me, which he said would cost another $500. I agreed, figuring it was worth the investment. The dispute letter went out 3 days later. It was 5 pages long, meticulously citing the CCRs, Virginia HOA statutes, and case law about what constitutes a modification versus maintenance. It argued that storm windows were routine energy efficiency improvements that did not materially alter the appearance of the property, and therefore did not require pre-approval. It demanded that the HOA immediately cease assessing fines and provide a hearing before the board within 30 days, as required by law. Brenda's response came a week later. It was 2 paragraphs, dismissive and condescending, reiterating that all exterior modifications required approval and that my violation was clear. She offered a compromise. If I removed the windows immediately, they would reduce the accumulated fines by 50%. Otherwise, they would proceed with placing a lien on my property. I was now up to $2,000 in fines. My compromise offer was rejected. The board hearing was scheduled for May 15th, nearly 2 months away, which Brenda claimed was the earliest they could convene a special meeting. Those 2 months were hell. Sophie was colicky, crying for hours every night. Emma was struggling with postpartum depression. My job as a project manager for a construction firm was demanding, and I was getting 4 hours of sleep a night if I was lucky. And hanging over everything was this growing debt to an HOA that seemed determined to destroy us over storm windows. I spent my few free moments building a case. I photographed every house in Willowbrook Estates, documenting all the exterior modifications I could find. I found 11 houses with unapproved changes, replacement doors that were different styles from the originals, decorative shutters that were not standard, mailboxes that did not match the approved model, landscape lighting, even a couple of houses with what looked like security cameras mounted on the exterior. I pulled property records and cross-referenced them with HOA architectural approval records, which were public documents. None of these modifications had been approved. None of the homeowners had been fined. I also discovered something interesting while researching Brenda Patterson. Her house had a backyard pergola that was not visible from the street. I asked a neighbor who lived behind her about it, a friendly guy named Ron who liked to talk. He told me Brenda had that pergola built about 18 months ago. I checked the architectural approval records. No application, no approval. Armed with this information, I showed up at the board hearing on May 15th ready for a fight. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. The board consisted of 5 people. Brenda Patterson as president, Craig Milton as vice president, Joyce Henderson as secretary, Robert Chen as treasurer, and Linda Vaughn as a general board member. About 15 other homeowners were in attendance, most looking bored, probably there for other routine business. Michael Richardson sat next to me, his briefcase full of documents. When we got to my agenda item, Brenda read a summary of the violation and the accumulated fines, which were now at $3,500. She asked if I wanted to make a statement. I stood up, my hands shaking slightly. Yes, thank you. I am here to dispute these fines on 3 grounds. First, storm windows are not explicitly covered under Section 7.3 of the CCRs. The examples provided are major structural changes, and storm windows do not fall into that category. Second, storm windows are maintenance items designed to improve energy efficiency, not aesthetic modifications. Third, the HOA has selectively enforced this provision, ignoring numerous other exterior modifications throughout the community. I handed out copies of my photo documentation to each board member. These are 11 examples of unapproved exterior modifications in Willowbrook Estates. None of these homeowners have been fined. This selective enforcement suggests that the action against me is arbitrary and discriminatory. Brenda barely glanced at the photos. The board has discretion to determine which modifications require approval and how to enforce our covenants. These other examples are not relevant to your case. They are absolutely relevant, Michael interjected smoothly. Virginia law requires HOAs to enforce their covenants uniformly. Selective enforcement is a violation of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing implied in every contract, including HOA agreements. Craig Milton, a balding man in his 60s, spoke up. We are not lawyers. We are volunteers trying to maintain a nice community. Mr. Kellerman installed storm windows without asking permission. That is the issue. The issue, I said, feeling anger rise in my chest, is that storm windows are not clearly prohibited, and you are charging me $50 a day for something that does not violate any rule. Meanwhile, Brenda has an unapproved pergola in her backyard, and I do not see her being fined. The room went silent. Brenda's face turned red. My pergola was approved. Show me the application, I said. I have reviewed the architectural records. There is no application for a pergola at 892 Maple Ridge Drive. That is none of your business, Brenda snapped. This meeting is about your violation, not my property. Actually, Michael said, if we are discussing selective enforcement, it is entirely relevant. Mrs. Patterson, if you installed a structure without approval, that undermines the entire basis for fining Mr. Kellerman. Robert Chen, the treasurer, looked uncomfortable. Maybe we should table this and review the architectural records. There is nothing to review, Brenda said sharply. Mr. Kellerman is in violation. The fines stand. If he does not pay and remove the windows, we will proceed with a lien. Linda Vaughn, who had been silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. I think Mr. Kellerman makes some good points. Maybe we should reduce the fines and let him keep the windows if they do not look bad. We are not negotiating, Brenda said. This is a board decision. All in favor of upholding the fines. Brenda, Craig, and Joyce raised their hands. Robert and Linda did not. Motion carries 3-2, Brenda said. Mr. Kellerman, you owe $3,500 and the daily fines will continue until you comply. This meeting is adjourned. I sat there in disbelief. Michael leaned over and whispered, We file suit tomorrow. True to his word, Michael filed a complaint in Richmond County Circuit Court the next day. The suit named the Willowbrook Estates, HOA, as defendant, and sought declaratory relief invalidating the fines, an injunction preventing further fines, and recovery of attorney fees. But Michael also included something else, a request for the court to investigate the HOA's governance and financial practices based on evidence of selective enforcement and potential self-dealing. That evidence was the pergola, but Michael had done some additional digging. He discovered that Brenda's son-in-law owned a landscaping company called Patterson Landscapes. Over the past 3 years, Willowbrook Estates had paid Patterson Landscapes over $60,000 for lawn maintenance and snow removal, all without competitive bidding. Virginia law requires HOAs to disclose related party transactions and follow their own procurement policies. Willowbrook's bylaws required bids for any contract over $5,000 annually. This was a clear violation. When the HOA received the lawsuit, they hired a lawyer, a guy named Peter Thornton from a firm that specialized in HOA defense. Peter was a shark, expensive and aggressive. He filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that I had not exhausted internal HOA remedies and that the business judgment rule protected the board's decisions. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was in July, 3 months after Sophie was born. Emma stayed home with the baby while I sat in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom, watching Michael argue against Peter. Judge Morrison was in her late 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened patiently to both sides, asking pointed questions. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "your argument is that the board has discretion to determine what constitutes a modification. But the CCRs list specific examples, and storm windows are not among them. How do you reconcile that? Your Honor, the list is illustrative, not exhaustive. The language says exterior modifications include but are not limited to those examples. But the examples are all major changes," Judge Morrison noted. "Decks, additions, fences. Storm windows are arguably in a different category entirely. That is for the board to determine, not the court. The business judgment rule protects board decisions made in good faith." "And what about the selective enforcement issue?" the judge asked. "Mr. Richardson has provided evidence of other unapproved modifications that were not penalized." Peter hesitated. "The board has discretion to prioritize enforcement." "That sounds like arbitrary enforcement," Judge Morrison said dryly. "And what about these allegations regarding related party contracts?" "That is a separate issue, Your Honor, not properly before the court in this case." "It goes to the credibility of the board's decision-making," Michael argued. "If the board is engaged in self-dealing and selective enforcement, that suggests bad faith, which defeats the business judgment rule." Judge Morrison tapped her pen on the bench. "Motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed to discovery. Mr. Thornton, your clients need to produce all architectural review records, board meeting minutes, and financial records related to vendor contracts for the past 5 years. Discovery deadline is September 1st. We will reconvene for a hearing on October 15th. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt both elated and terrified. We had survived the motion to dismiss, but now we were in full litigation. Michael estimated his fees would run at least $10,000, possibly more. I had a newborn, a wife who was still struggling emotionally, and a job that was not paying me enough to cover these legal bills. But I was not backing down. Discovery was a nightmare for the HOA. Michael subpoenaed everything: meeting minutes, emails, financial statements, contracts, architectural applications. What he found was damning. The Patterson Landscapes contracts were just the tip of the iceberg. Brenda's husband was a realtor who had received referral fees from the HOA for recommending contractors, a clear conflict of interest. Joyce Henderson, the secretary, owned a cleaning company that the HOA used for clubhouse maintenance, another undisclosed contract. The architectural review records showed a pattern of approving modifications for board members and their friends while denying similar requests from other homeowners. But the worst discovery was in the board meeting minutes. In a closed session back in March, right after I installed my storm windows, Brenda had explicitly stated that she wanted to make an example of me because I was a new homeowner, and she wanted to establish that the board would not tolerate unauthorized changes. Craig had agreed, saying they needed to show strength. The minutes were damning evidence that the fines were not about enforcing rules but about asserting power. Michael filed an amended complaint, adding claims for breach of fiduciary duty, and requesting that the court appoint a receiver to manage the HOA due to systematic mismanagement and self-dealing. He also moved for summary judgment on the original claim about the storm windows, arguing that no reasonable board could have found them to be a violation requiring approval. The October 15th hearing was packed. Word had spread through Willowbrook Estates about what was happening, and homeowners who had their own grievances against the board showed up. I recognized several faces from neighborhood barbecues and school events. Judge Morrison took the bench and spent 15 minutes reviewing the discovery materials. Then she looked at Peter Thornton. "Mr. Thornton, I have read the board meeting minutes from March. Your client explicitly stated she wanted to make an example of Mr. Kellerman. How is that consistent with good faith enforcement of the covenants?" Peter looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson was expressing frustration, but the underlying violation was legitimate." "Was it?" Judge Morrison pulled out photos of my house. "I am looking at these storm windows, and I cannot even tell they are there. They match the trim, they are professionally installed, and they serve a legitimate purpose. Meanwhile, I am seeing evidence of multiple other modifications that were ignored. This looks like selective enforcement to me." "The board has discretion, Your Honor." "Discretion is not unlimited," the judge said sharply. "And it certainly does not extend to using HOA authority to settle personal grievances or enrich board members through undisclosed contracts. I am granting summary judgment for Mr. Kellerman on the storm window issue. The fines are invalidated, and the HOA is enjoined from assessing any further penalties." I almost cheered, but Michael put a hand on my arm, keeping me quiet. "Now, as to the broader issues," Judge Morrison continued. "Mr. Richardson has presented substantial evidence of financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. This board has engaged in related party contracting without disclosure or competitive bidding, has enforced covenants selectively and in bad faith, and has used HOA funds for personal benefit. These are serious violations of Virginia law." Peter stood up. "Your Honor, the board is willing to resign and call for new elections." "That is not sufficient," Judge Morrison said. "The damage here goes beyond a few bad actors. The entire governance structure has been compromised. I am ordering the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association dissolved. Pursuant to Virginia Code Section 55.11834, I am appointing a state receiver to manage the association's affairs, collect assessments, pay legitimate debts, and oversee the transition to a new governance structure. The receiver will also conduct a full audit of the association's finances and recover any misappropriated funds." The courtroom erupted. Homeowners were talking over each other, some applauding, some looking shocked. Brenda stood up, her face purple with rage. "You cannot do this. We were elected by the homeowners. You were elected to serve the homeowners, Mrs. Patterson, not yourself. Your actions have violated the trust placed in you and the law. The HOA is dissolved effective immediately. You and the other board members are personally liable for any financial damages resulting from your misconduct. If my receiver's audit reveals criminal activity, I will refer this matter to the Commonwealth's attorney for prosecution." Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." I sat there in stunned silence as people filed out around me. Michael was grinning. "We won," he said. "Not just your case. You took down the entire board." The receiver appointed by Judge Morrison was a woman named Catherine Stevens, a professional association manager with 20 years of experience. She arrived at Willowbrook Estates 2 days later and immediately froze all HOA accounts pending the audit. What she found was even worse than we thought. Over the past 5 years, the board had misappropriated nearly $80,000 through fraudulent contracts, kickbacks, and outright embezzlement. Brenda had used HOA funds to pay for personal landscaping at her home. Craig had billed the HOA for snow removal that never happened. Joyce had inflated her cleaning invoices by 50%. Catherine referred the findings to the Henrico County Commonwealth's attorney in November. By December, Brenda Patterson, Craig Milton, and Joyce Henderson were all facing criminal charges: embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Robert Chen and Linda Vaughn, who had opposed some of the board's decisions, were not charged but were named as witnesses. The criminal proceedings moved faster than I expected. In January, barely 8 months after this whole ordeal started, Brenda pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was ordered to pay full restitution of $32,000, her share of the misappropriated funds, and sentenced to 18 months in prison with all but 60 days suspended. She would serve 2 months in county jail and be on probation for 3 years. Craig and Joyce reached similar plea deals. While the criminal cases proceeded, Catherine worked on rebuilding the HOA. She organized town halls to explain what had happened and what would happen next. She oversaw elections for a new board, this time with proper oversight and term limits. She renegotiated contracts with legitimate vendors, saving the association thousands of dollars annually. She even updated the CCRs to clarify what modifications required approval, explicitly stating that routine maintenance items like storm windows did not need pre-approval. In February, nearly a year after I installed those storm windows, I received a check from the HOA receivership for $12,300. It was reimbursement for my attorney fees, plus interest, paid from the recovered embezzled funds. Michael's bill had come to $11,000, so I actually came out slightly ahead. Emma and I celebrated that night with takeout Chinese food after putting Sophie to bed. She was almost 11 months old now, crawling everywhere, pulling herself up on furniture, on the verge of walking. Emma was doing better too, back to her normal self. The postpartum depression finally lifted. "I cannot believe it is over," she said, eating lo mein straight from the container. "I can barely believe it happened at all," I admitted. "Storm windows, that is what started this." "You could have just taken them down," Emma pointed out, not for the first time. "I could have," I agreed. "But it was not right. They were wrong and they were abusing their power. Someone had to stand up to them." "My stubborn husband," she said, but she was smiling. The new HOA board was elected in March. 5 homeowners I actually knew and trusted: a retired teacher, an accountant, a nurse, a software engineer, and a guy who ran a small business. Their first official act was to send a formal letter of apology to me for what the previous board had put my family through. Their second act was to vote unanimously to approve storm windows as an acceptable home improvement, not requiring architectural review. I ran into Ron, my neighbor, at the mailbox in April. He was the one who had told me about Brenda's pergola all those months ago. "Hey, Travis," he called out. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For taking on that board. Brenda made this neighborhood miserable for years. She fined me 3 times for having my trash cans visible from the street, even though I always brought them in the same day as pickup. She sent me nasty letters about my grass being a 1/4 inch too long. She was a tyrant." "I just wanted to keep my windows," I said. Yeah, but you did not back down. You exposed what they were doing. Half the neighborhood wanted to do something but were too scared. You actually did it. Other neighbors told me similar stories over the following weeks. The old board had been targeting people for years, usually newcomers or people they did not like personally. The selective enforcement I had discovered was just the surface. They had created a culture of fear and intimidation, making people afraid to improve their homes or even park in their own driveways without worrying about a fine. Sophie took her first steps in May, right around her first birthday. Emma and I threw a party in our backyard, inviting family and neighbors. People brought presents and food, and we set up a little tent for shade. Sophie toddled around the grass, falling down and getting back up, fearless and determined. I stood there with a beer in my hand, watching my daughter discover walking, surrounded by good people in a neighborhood that finally felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. The storm windows I had fought so hard for were barely visible from the backyard, just a subtle reflection of glass and white trim. Those windows had saved us close to $100 a month on heating and cooling over the past year. That was $1,200 annually, which meant they would pay for themselves in less than 3 years. But the real value was not financial. It was standing up for what was right. It was refusing to be bullied. It was exposing corruption and making sure it could not hurt anyone else. The final chapter of the whole saga came in June when Catherine Stevens submitted her final report to Judge Morrison. The receivership had lasted just over a year. In that time, she had recovered $82,000 in misappropriated funds, renegotiated contracts saving the association $14,000 annually, updated the governing documents to prevent future abuse, and overseen the election of a legitimate board. She recommended that the receivership be terminated and control return to the newly elected board. Judge Morrison approved the recommendation. In her order, she noted that this case should serve as a warning to HOA boards throughout Virginia that their authority comes with responsibilities and limitations. She praised the homeowners of Willowbrook Estates for participating in the reform process, and specifically mentioned my willingness to fight an unjust fine as the catalyst that exposed much deeper problems. I framed that part of the order and hung it in my home office, right above my desk where I could see it when I worked. Not because I was proud of being in a lawsuit, but because it reminded me that sometimes standing up for yourself has consequences far beyond what you expect. I just wanted storm windows. What I got was justice for an entire community. Emma went back to work part-time in August, and we enrolled Sophie in a daycare 3 days a week. Life returned to a comfortable routine. I went to work, came home, played with my daughter, had dinner with my wife. The HOA sent polite monthly newsletters about community events and maintenance schedules. The new board was boring in the best possible way, handling business efficiently without drama. In September, I was walking Sophie in her stroller when I passed Brenda Patterson's old house. There was a for sale sign in the yard. Ron had told me that Brenda and her husband were divorcing and selling the house. She had moved to an apartment somewhere after serving her jail time, trying to rebuild her life. I did not feel sorry for her exactly, but I did not feel triumphant either. She had brought it all on herself through greed and arrogance, but it was still a sad end to what probably started as genuine desire to keep the neighborhood nice. The house sold in October to a young couple with twins. They introduced themselves at a neighborhood block party, friendly and excited about being first-time homeowners. I welcomed them and told them about the HOA's recent history, wanting them to understand that the current board was nothing like the previous one. "We heard some stories," the husband said. "Something about the old president going to jail, long story," I said. "But the short version is the old board was corrupt and they got caught. The new board is great. You will like it here." And they would. Willowbrook Estates had transformed over the past year and a half. The fear was gone. People felt comfortable making reasonable improvements to their homes. The architectural review process was streamlined and fair. The community events were actually enjoyable instead of mandatory obligations. It felt like a real neighborhood. On Thanksgiving, Emma's parents came to visit, and my parents drove up from North Carolina. We cooked a massive turkey and spent the afternoon eating and watching football and playing with Sophie, who was now walking confidently and starting to say real words. After dinner, my father pulled me aside on the back deck. "Your mother and I are proud of you," he said. "What you did with that HOA situation, a lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on." "I could not let them push me around," I said. "It was not right." "It was not," he agreed. "But knowing something is wrong and actually doing something about it are very different things. You did something. You stood up. That is important." We stood there in the November cold, looking at the backyard and the pond beyond it. The storm windows kept the heat inside, but we had the door open, and I could hear laughter from the living room where everyone was gathered. "Those windows caused me a lot of trouble," I said. My father laughed. "Best $3,000 you ever spent." He was right. Not because of the energy savings, though those were nice, but because those storm windows had forced me to discover who I was when pushed into a corner. I was someone who would fight back, someone who would not accept injustice just because it was easier to comply. Someone who cared about principle even when it was expensive and stressful and time-consuming. I was someone who would stand up. Christmas came, and we decorated the house with lights and a big tree in the front window. Sophie was mesmerized by the lights, pointing at them and laughing. We took her to see Santa, and she cried when she sat on his lap, which was exactly what we expected. We had a quiet Christmas morning, just the three of us, opening presents and drinking coffee while Sophie played with wrapping paper more than the actual toys. The new year arrived, and with it came a sense of possibility. Emma and I started talking about maybe having another baby in a year or two. My job was going well, and I had gotten a promotion and a raise in December. Our finances were stable. The house was comfortable and efficient with those hard one-storm windows, keeping our heating bills reasonable even in the coldest weather. In February, the 2-year anniversary of buying the house, I got a letter from Michael Richardson. He was checking in to see how I was doing, and to let me know that the Virginia legislature was considering a bill to reform HOA governance statewide, partially inspired by what happened in Willowbrook Estates. The bill would require more transparency in HOA finances, mandate competitive bidding for contracts over a certain amount, and create clearer standards for what constituted selective enforcement. I called Michael to thank him for everything he had done. "You know, when I first came to your office, I was just trying to save some money on heating bills. I never imagined it would turn into all of this." "That is how it works sometimes," Michael said. "You start with something small and it becomes something big. You took a stand, Travis. You made a difference." After we hung up, I walked through my house, room by room, looking at everything we had built here. The nursery where Sophie slept, decorated with animals and stars. The kitchen where we cooked dinner every night. The living room where we watched movies and played on the floor with our daughter. The storm windows that had started everything, barely visible but making the whole house better. This was home. Not because of the structure or the location or the neighborhood amenities, but because it was ours, and because we had fought for the right to make it what we needed it to be. No one could take that away from us. No petty tyrant on a power trip could tell us we were not allowed to keep our family warm and comfortable. I thought about writing a book about the whole experience, but ultimately decided against it. The story was not really about me or even about Brenda Patterson. It was about the importance of community, of good governance, of standing up for what is right even when it is difficult. Those lessons did not need a book. They just needed to be lived. Sophie turned 2 in March. We had a party in the backyard again, this time with a bounce house and a dozen kids running around screaming with joy. Sophie wore a princess dress and a birthday crown, convinced she was royalty for the day. Emma and I stood together, watching the chaos, her hand in mine. "Can you believe it has been 2 years?" she asked, "since we moved in?" "No, it feels like yesterday and like forever at the same time." "So much has happened." "Yeah," I agreed, "but we made it through." "We did more than that," Emma said. "You changed things, you made it better." I pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We made it better. You supported me through all of it. You could have told me to just pay the fine and move on, and I probably would have listened. But you said to fight. So we fought, and we won." The party wound down as the sun started to set. Kids were picked up by parents. The bounce house was deflated and loaded onto a truck. Sophie crashed hard at 7, exhausted from excitement and sugar. Emma and I cleaned up the backyard, throwing away paper plates and collecting forgotten toys. When we finished, we sat on the back deck with glasses of wine, watching the last light fade from the sky. The storm windows reflected the sunset, turning orange and pink and purple before fading to darkness. Inside the house, the lights were warm and welcoming. This was peace. This was home. I never imagined that storm windows would change my life. I never imagined that a simple home improvement would lead to a legal battle, criminal charges, and the dissolution of an entire homeowners association. But sometimes life takes you places you do not expect. Sometimes standing up for something small leads to something much larger. The important thing is that you stand up at all, that you refuse to be pushed around, that you fight for what is right even when it is hard, even when it costs money and time and stress. Because at the end of the day, principle matters, justice matters. And your home, your castle, your family's comfort and security matters more than any petty bureaucrat's power trip. I installed storm windows to save money on heating bills. What I really did was save my community from corruption and tyranny. And I would do it all again, every stressful moment, every legal bill, every sleepless night worrying about the outcome. Because it was worth it. Because we won. Because justice prevailed. The storm windows are still on my house, doing their job quietly and efficiently, saving us money and keeping us comfortable. They look exactly like regular windows from the outside, unremarkable and ordinary. But every time I look at them, I remember what they represent. They are not just glass and aluminum. They are a symbol of resistance, a monument to standing up, a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance against injustice can have extraordinary consequences. And that is the real story, not about an HOA or a lawsuit or even storm windows. It is about refusing to back down when you know you are right. It is about fighting for your family and your home and your community. It is about being willing to stand alone if necessary, but hoping that others will stand with you when they see you taking that first brave step. That is what I did. I stood up. And when I did, a whole community stood with me, and together we tore down a corrupt system and built something better in its place. That is the story of my storm windows. That is the story of how I learned what I was made of, what I would fight for, and how far I would go to protect what matters. It is a story I will tell Sophie someday when she is old enough to understand. I will tell her that her father was not a hero or a crusader or anything special. He was just a guy who wanted to keep his family warm and refused to let anyone tell him he could not. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.